Hogwarts Legacy effectively channeled the Harry Potter films and delivered some truly beautiful visuals, especially in the game's current-gen outings back in February. In May, the game was ported to last-gen consoles, mostly preserving the current-gen visuals, but with some obvious graphical cutbacks. And now the game has finally hit Nintendo Switch, easily Hogwarts Legacy's weakest host platform. So with a fraction of the power of even last-gen home consoles, how has this technically demanding game been scaled to Nintendo's aging hybrid system? And even with the downgrades, is it still a good experience? Hogwarts Legacy on Nintendo Switch is one of the most comprehensively downgraded games I've seen in the modern era. Very few titles, even when ported to a low-power platform like the Switch, have been pruned and restructured to this degree. I'm going to start with the game's interiors, before moving on to visuals in the outdoors. Firstly, the game's lighting has been hugely cut back. The original Hogwarts Legacy, even on Xbox One S, like we're seeing here, had some really high-quality baked lighting, mixed with good real-time lighting, and a refined screen space ambient occlusion technique. On Switch, the pre-calculated lighting has a very different appearance. Flipping back and forth through these indoor scenes, the subtle interior shading that defined prior Hogwarts outings is just totally absent here, with a much more plain look. The ambient occlusion has been stripped out and replaced with a more primitive version, which adds coarse black shade around the edges of most objects, with little respect for lighting direction. And a lot of the real-time lighting has been stripped out of the interior spaces, with the lighting from the exterior window absent from this scene, for instance. These changes really make for a dramatic shift in the character and fidelity of Hogwarts Legacy. Look at the common room here. The color tone is very different, and the quality of the lighting is downgraded. We lose a lot of the subtle lighting detail around the windows in this hallway, and the bloom too. The lighting around the stairs in this central area doesn't make much sense anymore, and in these classroom interiors, the denser pockets of geometry around the walls don't look great, with heavy SSAO coverage. The assets have also been harshly decimated. This can be pretty inoffensive. Notice how the globe on the left has a less finely rounded surface on Switch, for instance. But sometimes there are stricter cutbacks on some of the especially dense meshes, like the lion statues here, which look basic on Switch. A lot of the smaller bits of environmental adornment have simply been removed, like the books in the dormitory here. Finally, some assets have been swapped for totally different artwork, like the bookshelf in the potion shop, or the new non-animated paintings in the wand shop. I also noticed one instance where the developers opted to simply block off a demanding view from the player. This courtyard on Xbox One opens up to a nice little lakeside view, but on Switch it's totally enclosed by a wall of stone. Sometimes games will throw up a bit of extra geometry to occlude a particularly demanding view, but this is an extreme case, and I think the area doesn't make nearly as much of an aesthetic impact as a result. Textures take a quality hit too. The fabric on this bed is a good example of the kind of texture quality you can expect when you get up close to a lot of objects in the game, as is this floral tapestry. The textures mostly look okay from a distance, though texture filtering is very poor, but up close the artwork just doesn't hold up. And a lot of the material properties in the environment have been simplified, as we don't seem to be getting a proper specular response anymore from many materials in the game, like the semi-gloss wood here. There are all kinds of little details that are absent when traversing the game's interior spaces as well. The outline shader that highlighted objects is gone, for instance. The high-quality motion blur that we saw before is stripped out of the game, and spells no longer cast dynamic lights. But I think I've given you a pretty good impression of how Hogwarts itself looks in this game. So let's take a trip outside. The outdoor areas in Hogwarts Legacy look totally different on Switch. There are some compromises that you'd probably expect to see. Foliage density has been decreased, for instance. This shot shows the cutbacks quite well. The trees are less numerous and have less foliage on their branches, the bushes have been simplified and scaled back, and the grass in the foreground is almost completely gone. Whether up close or at considerable distance, the foliage appears much higher quality on 1S. Shadow quality has been scaled back, and draw distance has been pulled in as well. and NPC animations now update at lower rates when distant from the player. But there are some changes I didn't really expect to see. Look at the rocky outcroppings along the shoreline here. The switch matches the 1S in very broad strokes, but features sharply angled, blank rock faces instead of the more intricate layers of rock that we see on 1S. The developers have gone back into the game and made big art changes to keep as few polygons on screen as possible while still maintaining reasonable quality and legibility. The water on Switch doesn't resemble 1S at all either. We used to see a very nicely detailed water surface in Hogwarts Legacy, which combined crisscrossing normal maps with a bit of wave geometry and screen space reflections to create a convincing impression of gently undulating water. Now we're getting a basically featureless water surface, with reflections provided by a low-quality cube map. There are no screen space reflections here, or anywhere else on Switch for that matter. I wouldn't necessarily have expected the same water treatment as the higher-end console platforms, but the difference in fidelity is striking. But the big issue with exteriors in Hogwarts Legacy isn't visual, it's structural. On Xbox One, the world of Hogwarts Legacy was mostly presented without loading screens. You could traverse the entire open world outside of Hogwarts without encountering a formal loading process, though sometimes before entering a building you'd have to pause for a few seconds before the door would open. On Switch, certain bits of the open world, like the entrance to the Hogsmeade Village area, are separated by a loading screen, with loading times sometimes in excess of 40 seconds or so. These also pop up before entering or exiting any of the buildings in Hogsmeade itself, with loading times of about 15 to 30 seconds. As a result, the Switch version of Hogwarts Legacy loses some of the open world feel that we see on the higher-end systems. Current gen versions of the game are basically seamless, with essentially no loads while playing. Last-gen consoles require a load between Hogwarts and the exterior grounds, and make you wait for a few seconds before loading certain building interiors, but otherwise offer a perfectly compelling open-world experience. But the Switch sometimes strains the modern conception of what an open-world game should be, with lengthy loads bookending short stretches of open-world gameplay. Image quality on Switch takes a big hit relative to what we see on Xbox One as well. Switch resolves to a 720p resolution typically here, dropping down to 540p in its lowest moments. But the Switch unexpectedly seems to drop anti-aliasing entirely, with no evidence of edge treatment in general play. That means chunky, unstable pixels all over the place, with a lot of shimmer in evidence anytime there is much object or camera animation. The Xbox One also offers a 720p image, albeit without dynamic res, but it uses TAA plus an FSR1 upscale to 1080p, and looks much more refined in comparison. Relative to the likely alternatives, a lower internal resolution with TAA or FXAA, the decision to keep the Switch's image more raw is perfectly defensible, though the constant pixel crawl does stand out. In portable play, that 720p pixel count takes a hit, clocking in at about 576p typically in my testing. I did spot dips, however, as low as about 360p at worst. It looks pretty decent on the portable display, and definitely fares a lot better than in docked mode on a large format 4K television. Outside of the resolution hit, I wasn't able to spot any signs of settings cutbacks on the Switch in portable mode, so the game doesn't come saddled with additional visual settings compromises relative to docked play. Frame rates on Switch are definitely less than ideal. If we hit up the typical Hogwarts Legacy stress tests, like running around Hogsmeade, we can sustain frame rates in the mid-20s for extended stretches, as the game basically constantly drops frames. Hop on a broomstick and zip around the Hogwarts grounds or the open world, and we're looking at a pretty similar performance pattern, if not a bit worse at times. Traveling through Hogwarts itself leads to similar drops, and the game heavily stutters too, as the Switch streams in new data. Even in less dense naturalistic environments, we're still getting a pretty steady barrage of dropped frames. It's unfortunate, but even with the broad array of settings cuts present in Hogwarts Legacy's Switch outing, we can't get anywhere near a stable 30 FPS in typical play. There are brief stretches of gameplay that do run at 30 FPS, but most of the time the game is managing some significant frame rate issues. The portable experience is subjectively quite similar to my eyes, struggling in the same circumstances. If we bring the Xbox One S back into the picture, we get some interesting results. Flying produces significant frame rate dips on both platforms, and the Switch sometimes actually performs slightly better. But running around dense artificial environments like Hogsmeade, the One S pulls way ahead of Switch, with a relatively steady 30 FPS update. The One S isn't providing a super stable experience or anything, but it's at least mostly hugging that 30 FPS line in typical play. I thought I'd bust out the Steam Deck too, which has some notorious performance issues in this game as well. The general performance level in Hogsmeade is definitely higher on the deck, but frame times are more unstable, ultimately producing a less consistent feel. Considering the heavy CPU demands this area can impose, I think the turnout on last-gen consoles and Switch is actually pretty good here considering the hardware, but it seems like the Switch simply isn't powerful enough to maintain a 30 FPS pace. Porting Hogwarts Legacy to Switch was always likely to be a challenging endeavor. This is one of the better looking pieces of current-gen software, and it already needed some pretty substantial cuts to run on last-gen home consoles. Developer Portkey Games has heavily reworked Legacy on Switch, making huge visual cuts, remodeling the environment, and adding loading screens to break up parts of the open world. This is one of the most heavily downgraded Switch conversions I've ever seen, and even after all those changes, the game is still far from a consistent 30 FPS update, with a near constant drumbeat of dropped frames. Ultimately, I think the experience on Switch just isn't good enough. So much of Hogwarts Legacy's appeal lies in its fidelity to the Harry Potter movies, with film locations replicated near perfectly in real-time 3D. On Switch, the game really doesn't make that impression at all, with a litany of visual cuts ruining the immersion. It can look unrecognizable measured up against the other home console versions, even the last-gen ones. I will grant that even though the final Switch conversion isn't especially successful, this is for the most part a reasonably playable version of Legacy. I'm sure for some less discerning players, this could be an enjoyable enough experience, but I have to strongly recommend playing on a more powerful console or PC system, where the visuals truly shine. Perhaps this would have been a good fit for the widely rumored Switch 2 console, but it certainly doesn't work well on original Switch hardware. It's just very hard to recommend Hogwarts Legacy on Switch if you care at all about game visuals or performance. It's a bridge too far for the aging hybrid console platform. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and press the bell for YouTube notifications. Check out the Patreon at digitalfoundry.net for exclusive and early access content. And to get in touch, use social media. Thanks for watching.